All right, here we are. This is Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown. If this just so happens to be your first time here today, let me welcome you. Everyone else, what's up? What is going on? If you have been around, you know over the last few weeks and months, it's been unavoidable for me to be pointing out how much it feels like things are collapsing or like that there's been so much change over the last few years and there's been something that feels lost and there's a grief around that, and a lot of us are finding ourselves at what feels like real crossroads. Well, I'm also wondering if anybody listening to this has been noticing any kernels of possibility, any little subtle hints of potential avenues for creation. You see, a few things have happened in the last week or so that make me feel like it might be possible. It might be possible to make something even now. And I know I'm being vague, and frankly, there's a whole long story to tell around what is happening with me right now. But it's not come to a conclusion yet, and it's maybe a little bit too long a story to tell in this moment. Partially because my conversation today with Eddie Ellner is quite epic and lengthy. But really, even more than that, the conversation I have with Eddie is directly in relation to what's happening with me. So it makes sense for us to listen to the conversation with Eddie before I tell you anything that might be happening with me this week. So we're going to leave it floating out there for now. Let me mention that Eddie is the founder of Yoga Soup, which is a yoga center in Santa Barbara, California, that he has been operating since 2006. And a listener of the show mentioned him to me. I originally reached out to him because I wanted to talk to him about opening yoga centers and how he's managed to keep his going. And I quickly learned how much that Eddie has been a witness to the evolution of yoga over the last several decades. One of the main missions of this show has been to set oral history and hear the stories of those who were there so we can get a clearer perspective on how we got to where we are. And Eddie couldn't be a more perfect example of that. So it was a great pleasure to get to meet him and have this conversation with him. And I'm very glad to be sharing it with you today. Real quick before we get to it, let me mention that this would be a last call for my live event in Austin, Texas, May 4th and 5th. If you are listening to this at the time of its publication or shortly thereafter, this coming weekend, I'm going to be in Austin, Texas doing a workshop. You can come to one session. You can come to all sessions. If you're around, come hang out. Otherwise, there's ongoing stuff online, live classes, discussion group. Podcast premium. If you're enjoying what you're getting from the show and you want to have access to the full length archives and really be a supporter, be someone who's helping me keep doing this, the way that you would do that is through a podcast premium subscription. For as little as $5 a month, you can definitely make a difference. And we are so appreciative of anybody who's doing it. So if you want to find out about live events, ongoing stuff online, or podcast premium, everything can be found at jbrownyoga.com. Okay, we are going to leave it there. We're keeping it brief, as I said. I will touch base with you on the other side for a moment, but let's go ahead and get into this. Let's listen to this conversation that I had with Eddie Ellner. Hi.
Jay Brown, this is you.
This is me. You must be Eddie Ellner.
Apparently. Rumor has it.
Fancy meeting you here.
Amazing. Amazing, sir.
Thank you so much. I don't know how familiar you are with this show, but if it's okay, I'm already recording and I'd like to consider us having just begun. Is that all right?
We have begun. We probably began 30 years ago.
It sounds like that. I appreciate you saying that. Maybe you did a little research. I was getting ready to talk with you and I was stunned by some parallels and synchronicities. Seems we might have been in some same yoga classes together at one point.
Well, yes, I'm sure. I haven't researched you. I actually became a supporter of your podcast.
Oh, that's very kind of you.
Because I got such a kick just in the last couple of days listening to talks with many of my original teachers.
Mm-hmm.
And I just was, it helped me. It helped bring me back to, it's very easy, in all our wanderings to forget what it was back in the beginning. And to remember that out of that perspective, which, for me was wide-eyed and innocent and dumb and open. It's like anything. Then you've been around so many blocks that, wow, in order to get back to that place that was just open. And to hear, you talk with Brian Kest and Sean Korn and Nikki Costello and I completely appreciate, your perspective. And the kind of the line that you hold around, how the ways in which this, whatever this is, this yoga practice, this industry has moved over the years. And so,
wow, I usually try to do like a little intro for like why I'm talking to someone, but you just did it. That was the intro. That was exactly right. I really appreciate that. Thank you. I'm glad that you've gotten something out of those talks. It's been a process for me of doing the show, just to like retrace it and try to figure out, like, I've often said it, like I started out, I was like in my early 20s, like you said, very wide-eyed. Like I didn't want to have an office job. I didn't want to get an advertising job like you had, right? Working for some ad agency or whatever. And yoga was like a countercultural move, And it was, I never thought of it as like, oh, this is going to be my profession or like a career. It was like kind of like a step away from that being like the focus of my life. But it did shift and change. And when I started this podcast in 2015, I was in my 20s, I was in my 40s, and I had 2 kids and I had a yoga center that was going down the tubes, And I was like trying to make sense of it. I was like, how did we get here,
Wow. So that was the initiation. You just wanted to check in with people and it seemed like a different career path.
Well, it wasn't even a career path. It was just wanting to talk about it. It was also like everything had started to change online before it really changed. Because there was the blogosphere when I first before there was podcasts, there was like all these common threads and kind of actually a lot of great stuff happening online in the yoga world for a while. But it did kind of turn at one point and everything got kind of Instagramified, and you had all these like hashtag yoga every damn day and like these like yogis with like massive social media following, and all the teachers I knew were getting like hip replacements, and they couldn't afford to rent on their centers anymore because the gentrification had caught up with them,
Yeah. I mean, I've definitely been a fly on the wall in so many different places over the last 30 years that is just in recollecting it. It's just astonishing.
Well, that's a good point, actually. You have been very low key. You have a very light digital footprint. And the only reason I know about you really is a listener, and I wish I had gone and looked up. It might be my friend Anita. If it's you, Anita, shout out. Thank you. Somebody who was listening and said, hey, you should look up Eddie Ellner. And then they said it because I've been doing this whole series of like wanting to talk to people who've managed to kind of like hold it down all these years. And they said he's been doing it since, 2001 or something, and he's still doing it to this day. And I was like, okay, I want to talk to him. But then once I kind of did a little bit of checking, there's like a couple articles and there's like one podcast from 2009 with you, which is really good, by the way. And I thought, oh, wow, this guy really, there's a really important reason actually for me why we're talking right now, why I've never heard of you until now, because... And we can get into this more later too, maybe, but it has something to do with the way that things have changed at some point, like the yoga teacher became the brand. And nowadays I've been really feeling like this impulse about making a place. And I know that Yoga Soup for you is a lot about, from what I can tell, from what I've seen, like about a place that you were making. Like it wasn't branded around you, like in ways that other teachers
definitely
did.
Not. Definitely not. I mean, I think, I mean, that's part of the origin story for me that, and listening to some of the talks and just, I mean, being in this world for as long as I have and meeting, you know how it is, the hundreds, thousands of people, that level of a human nature, the grandiosity, the amplification that comes with the light being shined on you, people projecting on you in a certain way. The ranks that I came up, I got to see that. I was really fortunate to be up close and personal.
Sorry to interrupt you, but that's what I was thinking about specifically around like a place like Jivamukti on 2nd Avenue in 1992, which is when I stumbled into my first yoga class there. And I read that you maybe first went to class at the Crunch Gym, maybe a little bit before that, or where was your first class? It was in New York, wasn't it?
Yeah, well, I'm from New York. I'm a New Yorker.
Okay.
And so I came to yoga at Crunch at a class called Urban Yoga Workout with a guy named Noel Daniels, who to this day I don't know what his lineage was. I don't know where he studied, and I stumbled into this class at a point in my life where it was the threads were starting to pull. Like an important relationship had broken up, and I quit the one real job I had. I had a very, I wrote for magazines. I was a creative director at a publishing company. I read
that you wrote for professional wrestling magazines. Is that right?
Oh, well, for 10 years. It was, huge part of my, I wrote for wrestling magazines, boxing magazines, women's magazines. I fancied myself. That was my career trajectory. I'd write scripts and, but the truth is my life was starting to unravel where, my grandmother who I grew up with, she died, the relationship broke up, I quit my job. And all of a sudden, I walk into a yoga class and also the body that I had constructed, I was, belonged to 2 gyms and I played every sport and I lived in Brooklyn. I'd bike over the Brooklyn Bridge to work on 57th Street. There wasn't enough exercise that I could do that would satisfy my body or really satisfy my mind. And when I walked into that class where this guy just lit a bunch of candles and he's playing Enya,
and that was at Crunch Gym. We should note that was at Crunch Gym.
That was at the first Crunch, the only Crunch.
Yeah.
Before it became a franchise, it was just this one guy. It opened up this really unique, right? I mean, I don't know if you remember it.
I remember it was like on 13th Street or something.
It was on 11th Street.
11th Street, yeah.
And then he had another one on Charles Street.
Yeah.
but so once I went to that class, and like I'd never done anything. Of course, I'd heard of yoga, but I'd never done anything like that where you're opening, you're laying down, you're stretching, you're pause, all the things that, obviously we know are the positive characteristics of a yoga class were completely contrary to the way I had constructed my body, which really, it wasn't really a body anymore. It was just this thick wall of protection that as I started to attempt to do some of these movements, I quickly realized that something, whereas in other areas of physical activity, I'm super capable. This one, like, what is going on here? And yet it seemed there was no choice. I really, after the first class, I just never stopped going to class. And it became like a secret, I didn't tell anybody. But now I'm in that world. I'm asking the teacher, for help. At the end of the class, my back is so rounded. I have such a big hump in my back, and my body is so kind of misshapen that anything he did to me, like pulled my head out in Shavasana, that typical adjustment. Mm-hmm. This is better than this. I don't even have words to describe it. I could say it's a drug experience or it's like sex, but it's different. There's just something different about it.
All right, let me ask you a quick question about that, something different. We've talked about this on the show many times. Some people describe like, that first Shavasana, or the teacher came over and aligned me in my triangle pose and I started to cry, like people have experiences, like things happen, like you say. But what I took note of in that, what you were just saying, is it was at Crunch Gym, which wasn't a big chain yet. And the teacher lit candles or incense, and it was also about a certain ambiance and a certain space that was getting created.
Absolutely.
And I guess I'm interested in that part of it too. Like, yes, we're engaging the body in a certain way that was kind of bringing you into your body in a certain way that your sports wasn't, maybe. But there was these other elements that at that time, there's always was chanting and incense in the classes. It was still had one foot in kind of like its mystical roots, maybe.
Well, not in his class, not that I recall.
So not in urban yoga workout. There was no
I think
mystical roots.
Obviously, it was his attempt to, obviously he was trained traditionally, but how he interpreted it and offered it to the students was non-denominational. I don't think he didn't use any Sanskrit terms for the poses. So it was a perfect introduction for me. Then as life had it, I had some friends I went to a wedding in Big Sur, and I'd never been to Big Sur. And at their wedding, it was officiated by a woman who channeled an Egyptian priestess, and then they lit sage. I'm from New York, and I have no introduction to any of this stuff. And then these same friends of mine were going to Europe for 4 months, and they said I could, go live in their house in Hollywood, and they told me about Yogaworks. So I had about 4 months of this urban yoga workout under my belt. And now I get to Hollywood, and I have their car, and I drive their car to Yogaworks in Santa Monica. And this is, that story about the frog who lives in a well and then sees the ocean and then explodes. Because that's what that was like. Just Yogaworks was, this was in 93, I think, 93 or 94. I had no context for it. That all these different classes, everything seemed new and strange and compelling. And I have no skin in the game. So I don't know what teacher is what. I'm just there taking classes. at the
With
time,
like the foundational teachers, as Brian Kest was on just recently talking about that. I had Max Strom on and all those folks. That was like some very like formative time in like the yoga world.
Yeah, Brian Kest. Brian Kest was certainly my original teacher. You know, Brian Kest, across the hall, there was Steve Ross.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't really like going to a yoga class. It was like going to a club.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that same vibration where you're about to enter a place where everything is happening and there's beautiful people and it's the middle of the day.
Mm-hmm.
And there's movie stars and there's personalities and it's dripping with common sense, because God bless Brian Kest. I think he's an underappreciated innovator. Maybe at this point he's gotten his just, praise, but he held that space. Now, I don't know anything about Brian's personal life, but there's so much energy in that space directed to him. And somehow, at least for me personally, when he would come over and adjust me, I said, why are you adjusting me? There's 25 of the most beautiful women I've ever seen in my life. Why me? I felt so blessed by the touch of a teacher, given the stories that I would tell about myself and about what's going on in this room. And then across the hall, this guy, Steve Ross, who really became my primary influence. I can't call him a teacher because he wasn't a teacher. He was a personality, and he played music. If he wasn't the first person to play music, I'm pretty sure he was the first person to play the kind of music that he played. And he had a complete irreverence for any of the trappings of yoga. So for me, simultaneously, I don't know anything. Brian, of course, was influenced by Vipassana and Ashtanga. And Brian would have alignment instructions and it was a brutal class. It was so hard. And at the same time, he was advocating being, sane and gentle and not being in your ego. Whereas Steve could give a shit about anything. He'd say, yoga isn't about putting your little toe down. It's not about alignment. It's about finding joy in your heart. And as a teacher, I discovered from him that if you play, say, the right song at the right time, it will blow you open as much as any asana adjustment or any chant. It's not about, nowadays, of course, everyone has a playlist. It's more about choosing the right song at the right time, at least for me. As I grew as a teacher, I love music. The context for music, though, is completely about, is this appropriate to play in class? Say, like a song I grew up with as a teenager, Brain Damage, Pink Floyd.
I used to play Bob Marley and stuff in my class and whatever. At some point, though, I changed that. That's true.
Well, but what I mean by Brain Damage, I'm saying there's the chorus of that song is, there's someone in my head and it's not me. Now, for me, that's the only point of the yoga class, to get to a place where you realize, holy smokes, I am being manipulated, run around by thoughts. And I think I have no choice but to chase them. Most of my thoughts are a combination of fear and desire. That's it. My whole life can be defined by, am I running from fear and chasing desire? And here's a group that sings. It's much more effective when you sing it, that whatever thought is coming up in your head, it's not you. Well, to me, that's over the years, that's the only teaching worthwhile, but from that experience at Yogaworks, and I should say that to get to Yogaworks, I had to drive this Jeep Cherokee, and one day on the freeway, the engine exploded. And
the 101 freeway?
I or no, it was the 10 freeway, whatever it was.
Yeah.
I
Oh, that's
call
the
my
Santa
friends-
Monica. That's right.
I call my friends in Europe and I tell them what happened. And they say to me, oh, okay. What were you thinking? It's like what? I'm thinking, how am I going to get off this freeway alive? And they say, no. What were your thoughts before the car exploded? And it's like, because they're trying to get me to see that my thoughts were responsible for the car exploding. And then I was in, the 4 months that I was going to classes in Santa Monica at Yogaworks, I finally got to a yoga retreat up at White Lotus in Santa Barbara, the place Ganga White runs. And at a Steve Ross yoga retreat. And I'd never been in an environment like this. Like everything about it was incredible. And then he did, during his retreats, he chants. He's an amazing singer. And he also does holotropic breathing. You're familiar with,
Yes.
Stan Groff. Back then, not everybody was doing breathing stuff. There was no Wim Hof. There was no variations. And so there was that experience that got folded into the yoga experience where, okay, we're going to lay down and you're going to breathe through your mouth for an hour. And I came out of it. I went up to Steve like a 4-year-old and saying, do you feel like this all the time? No drugs were involved. I don't know how I've never experienced a state of being like this in my life. So it's not just the yoga practice, it's all the kind of the auxiliary elements that get filtered in to, in the end, just an understanding of, well, who am I? What the hell's going on? And with Brian, and then there was the whole drama around Yogaworks.
Now, wait a second. Let me ask you a question. Like, you mentioned that you were there for 4 months. Like you said, you took that initial trip. Like someone said, oh, I've got a place you can stay in Hollywood or whatever. Did you go back to New York? When do you move? You moved to Santa Barbara eventually, right? So,
well, after 4 months, and I didn't want to leave. I dropped into Yogaworks and I thought, I was taken, to the routine. You just start taking classes.
Yeah.
And,
I went there in 94 and I took a class with Eric Schiffman, and then I took a class with Anna Forrest at her little spot. Like it was a very thriving time in yoga, very exciting time. The classes were really pretty electric, I remember.
What I realized in retrospect though was, okay, I go to Steve's class and he's playing music and he's dancing in class, and everyone comes out like they've just been to a party, beautiful. And at the end of class, the only kind of, say liturgical, or yoga philosophical comment he'd make the entire class would be, if you're not who you think you are and you're not who others think you are, then who are you? And that would be it. And then I go to Brian's class, which was just brutal. You felt you were in a...
it's funny you say that because I asked him about that because he coined the phrase power yoga, but he's talking about how we should be gentle. And I was sort of saying, well, if you talk about being gentle, but then the class you do is not really all that gentle, how does that work? And he kind of talked around it and said he used the practice to get people to the gentle thing, but... That was a kind of thing. There was a rhetoric around some things, but then the actual practice didn't always be expressing it, it seemed.
God, there's so many stories. I wouldn't even know how to begin. But so, Brian, we're just human beings. Part of my observation of this whole yoga world is how, and I would be in class with people, and then they would go through a teacher training, and then they'd become a teacher. And it's like, what happened? Like yesterday, you were just an ordinary asshole like me, and now you're a yoga teacher. And suddenly, the danger of being a yoga teacher cannot be overestimated, because now you're given permission not only to touch people however you want, but also to speak about, the wisdom of the world as if you've been through something. And it's mind-boggling to me to watch that transformation. And I saw it happen. I mean, it's not like I'd be naming names because it's human nature. Like, I think that's the point, that people are, for me personally, my life was, I didn't know what to do with my life. And yoga, all I knew is that the philosophy and psychology of this practice and the physicality of it made a lot of sense to me. But I never considered myself a teacher.
I mean, I read somewhere that the first class you taught was at the White Lotus in New York City. Is that right?
Well, no, the White Lotus is a yoga retreat center in Santa Barbara.
Oh, the retreat center, not the center. Okay, yeah.
No,
I got confused.
But what happened at the end of the Yogaworks gig? The first one was, gosh, at the end of Brian's class, at the end of Steve's class, and then I started going to Mati. Mati used to teach an introduction to Ashtanga, and I used to take that class to kind of get the cadence of, Ashtanga. I mean, back then I was in my kind of early mid-30s, so I still had the body and the temperament for that kind of activity, and I realized at the end of class, it didn't much matter what class I had been in. My preference for it, obviously I preferred some classes and some personalities, but at the end, after you've been run through the routine according to the kind of the whims of that particular instructor, I'd feel the same. And that was something that stayed with me, because obviously there's so many different lineages, and then people splinter from their lineage and they start their own trip, and like you said, it becomes more about the teacher than, I don't even want to say that, than the teaching. And I think a lot of teachers, and I speak for myself, needed something. You need to be approved of. You need, there's certainly enough failed artists who end up being yoga teachers, that you need some kind of affirmation, some kind of, you're worthwhile, you can do this, and which is really just a healing of the human condition. And the best yoga teachers, and when I say best, I mean the people who probably offer the most value, are the ones who eventually realize that. Like for me, there was certainly, when I left Yogaworks, I went back to New York, and someone at Yogaworks, someone at White Lotus told me about Jivamukti. And so I was living with my girlfriend on 11th Street, and I started going to Jivamukti on, the original one.
Yeah.
And this was so temperamentally different than Yogaworks. And of course I fell in love with Sharon Gannon, and of course,
Can you say more about what that difference was? Because I came in, that's where we may have taken classes together, right? And I'm curious, what did you observe the difference as between Yogaworks and Jiva?
Well, first of all, at Jivamukti, you're walking up this long staircase.
Yes, like above the Thai food.
Yeah.
Yes.
And then you go into these two very small rooms that are mostly dark.
And they smell like Nag Champa for sure.
And there's a carpet. You're practicing on a carpet, as I recollect. Or they would roll
rugs.
Up the carpet.
They had those big rugs. They did big rugs. Yeah.
And there's chanting. There was no chanting at Yogaworks. And there was at that point there was a real. So the last chanting that I had been exposed to was in Hebrew school.
Yes, me too. My Haftorah at the bar mitzvah.
No memory of Hebrew school was pleasant. And yet, I remember being in a class, and then Sharon Gannon puts on Heroes, David Bowie song. Mm-hmm. And it's another connection. It's like, what the hell? Like, you can do this. Mm. You can play a song like that at a moment in class where, my God, it just, my heart is open, or something opens up, and it spills into my experience of being in my body. There's this sense of connection and exhilaration and joy that is hard, and everybody tries to bottle it, but it's actually a spontaneous act of creation, as far as I could tell. Because there are many years I taught 2 classes a day or 3 classes a day, and if I tried to duplicate them, it always felt it didn't feel right to me. And
yes, I always call them virtuosic improvisatory moments.
Yeah. Beautiful. And so the funny thing, I was still writing for magazines, and so I would write a story about Brian Kest, and I'd write a story about Steve Ross, and of course I interviewed Sharon, who just was this otherworldly, powerhouse.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember after like a few months there, he says, "You should come to this kirtan tonight." And I said, well, I had no idea what a kirtan was, but basically anything she said I should come to, I would have. So I came back to Jivamukti at night, and she told me that there's a guy, Krishna Das, who's going to perform on Monday night. And so I'm waiting in kind of that area for it to start, and I talk to this guy who kind of looks like me.
Yes, I talked with him about this on the show. He's like, he was a Jew guy who did the chanting. Yeah. Yes.
So I asked him, I say, so who is this Krishna Das? And he says, oh, it's this exotic guy. You're not going to believe it, when you see him. And then we go into the room. There's 5 people there, me, 2 other people, and Sharon and David. And then the guy I just spoke to walks in, and I think he's like the warm-up act or something. And he sits down with his harmonium, and he starts to play, and everyone starts to, om. And that was Krishna Das, of course. And I look around the room, it's like, what the fuck? This is not for me. And as soon as I was sure everybody's eyes were closed, I just ran out down the stairs. You know the area. I went to St. Mark's Place, to Grassroots Tavern, and sat in front of the TV watching a ball game with, with an Absolute cranberry juice.
Yeah.
Because chanting, I was not ready for that yet.
Mm-hmm.
But fast forward, I don't know, not many years later, my brother got tickets to the World Series, and we get on the 4 train, and we're going to Yankee Stadium, and we pass the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, right, in order to get there. And I know that night, Krishna Das is going to be chanting there. And everything in me would have preferred to be at the chant than at the World Series. And that's kind of the disordering of worlds. It starts to happen. It happens slowly. It happens quickly. You don't realize it's happening to you, but it's such a magical, once you realize what's happening, that you're being worked on in a certain way to ask questions about things that you didn't consider asking questions about. And the depth and breadth of the people you meet. Like I know you must have gone to, the Yoga Journal conferences and, things like that. That as I started to get more of a footing, understand the landscape a little bit. Yeah, I lived with Sean Korn and her then boyfriend, Saul David Ray. I don't know if you know of him. And
that was when she was in New York, right? When she was on the show,
this was in Santa Monica.
I see, in Santa Monica. Well, wait a second. Let me ask you a question then before we talk about that. When you're living in Santa Monica, I guess I'm curious. You go to the White Lotus, you come back, you have some time in Jivamukti. Interesting what you said about Krishna Das. When he came on, for me, it was a very big moment. Like, I had an experience at a kirtan with Krishna Das, and it kind of blew my mind, and I couldn't explain it. And it was a very significant moment. But it's also very interesting to me because, that kirtan, at some point, that became a lightning rod at Jivamukti. I'm curious, how long did you spend in New York at Jivamukti before you went back to the West Coast? Because I remember I talked with Leslie and other people about this, where there was a moment at Jivamukti where they started their teacher training program.
Yep, I was there.
And then it became required that all the teachers who taught there had to go to kirtan. And that's when a bunch of teachers left, because it kind of started a standardization process or something.
Yeah, Jay, I had such an advantage over everybody else because I had no illusions about my path. Like the idea of me doing a teacher training, the idea of me like participating on any other level but that as a stumbling, bumbling, fumbling student did not occur to me. So the politics of it, didn't interest me at all. I didn't experience the place like that. All I knew is that whatever I used to do to pass the time, I now wanted only to go to class at Jivamukti. My girlfriend, she had a great job. She was a producer. She'd go to work and she'd think that I was home writing, and I would just spend the day going, getting nice coffee, going to Temple in the Village, this little, and
Angelica Kitchen.
Yeah, going to East West bookstore
yes.
and starting to read these things and just slowly being immersed into a world that's so jumbled, right? Like there's so much. Like, what's real? What's the real teaching? Who knows what? Like, it's
and
so
you never decided to get on board with a particular lineage? Because back then, those teachers all went to India and studied with Patabi or BKS.
No, but my first experience at Yogaworks was when Patabi Joyce was at Yogaworks, and I remember because there's Kareem Abdul-Jabbar practicing. And
you were a sports guy, and Kareem was there.
But it's more like what's really happening here? There's so much. There's spirituality. There's the dressing up spirituality. There's the sexuality. There's the tension. There's I was so both lost and open and susceptible, I think. And I'm also a cynical New Yorker, and I'm not, I'm not stupid. The interesting thing for me is I'm not stupid, but I got to see how much I wanted to believe.
Yeah, I read that you had a stint in the Anyasara world. I've had people who were kind of on the inner circles of that come on the show to talk about that. Well, I mentioned it only because it was a very significant thing, like you were saying, in terms of it becoming a bit more of a career or a profession. And I remember looking in a Yoga Journal magazine, and it was choose your style, and it had BKS Iyengar and Patabi Joyce and Desika Char, all these Indian teachers, and next to it was John Friend Anyasara, and it was oh, you can make your own yoga system.
Right. Well, I remember going to Kripalu. It must have been, I don't know, 1999 or, something way back then. Mm-hmm. And I had, I met Shiva Ray at Yogaworks before she was even teaching. I think she was just apprenticing, in the Mysore practice. She was helping adjust people. And now she's partially ascended to that kind of royal place in kind of the yoga teacher pantheon. And she's there, and the other guy, Baron Baptiste, there are famous yoga teachers there. And I remember being in taking a class with Shiva Ray, who knew me, and I couldn't do a back bend. I couldn't straighten my arms in, Urdhva Dhanurasana. And she says, "You're a teacher. You should be able to do this." And whoa, and I thought she was right. I didn't think she was wrong. It's my body was so thick that the basic poses, I couldn't master them. I couldn't even get into them. And at that Kripalu retreat was a guy named Philip Moffat, who used to write a column for Yoga Journal, and he used to be the editor of Esquire magazine. And he was more of a meditation teacher than an asana teacher, but he said something. One of his alignment instructions has always stayed with me. He says, imagine you have helium balloons in your armpits. So from that visualization, something happened. It's like, wait a second, nothing has actually changed in my physical body, but I feel so much more spacious. And oh, that's part of this. It's like the body itself that, for the first 30 years of my life, I manipulated only through fear and desire and vanity and all the usual things. There's another, and obviously the koshas, the more you study, that there's a sensibility that comes internally. And that's a thing. It exists. And at that same retreat, there was Angela Farmer. I know you've interviewed her, who broke with Iyengar. But
who wasn't saying that? Who wasn't saying you had to be able to do a certain thing with your body in order to be a teacher?
Exactly. And then there was
she was saying,
teacher.
Can you feel your tail? That's what she was saying.
Exactly. Right? Well, to speak to that, there was another teacher, Emily Conrad, who started this movement called Continuum. And she had us lay down on the ground and writhe around like a snake or a sea serpent without a spine. And so these are all things that started to contribute to my understanding of, okay, well, what is going on here? Like, how do you get back into a natural body that had been manipulated by all the places your mind has taken it? And that's really been the current that I've followed. Like I remember asking Brian Kest, how do you open up your body? And he says, well, go to India and get dysentery and lose 50 pounds. That's probably the easiest way.
That's terrible advice.
But it's funny because I would go ask all the big shot teachers because I wanted to know what the hell was wrong with me. Like I went to Paul Grilly and I said, I can't open, my shoulders. And he says, well, it's just the way you're constructed. And, which was part of his trip.
That's his whole thing. That's what yin yoga all became about. Exactly.
Yeah. But it didn't, it's not that I wanted to believe him. Paul Grilly and Steve Ross were best friends. And it's like, I enjoyed the company. And Steve Ross is someone who I became friendly with. He kind of took me under his wing and I ended up organizing his retreats for many years up at White Lotus. And I just got to see the contradictions inherent. Like yoga teachers are not immune to the contradictions and paradoxes of the human condition. They actually amplify them because they're so quickly put up on a pedestal. And then any display of humanity, obviously you have all these, whether it's Kripalu with Amrita Sai or John Friend, like it's such a shock that these people fall from grace. But to me, it's like Bernie Madoff. It's like the people who invest, they know something's going on, but they don't want to know. They just like the return. They like the money. And
I have a quote. I'm going to stop you for a second because I have a quote. Sure. I almost never do this, but I have a quote from you that I wrote that is to what you're saying. You wrote, it was an interview maybe, you said, the commodification and monetization of healing binds everyone to their domain. Truth cannot be transmitted from one to another. It must be realized in oneself. Everything else is a pyramid scheme.
Well, yeah. Yeah.
And I was like, oh my gosh, I think that's the dilemma of where it was like a practice and then there was an exchange of value when we were starting to pay our rent from it. But at a certain point, it did shift. And then everybody had their own brand and their own business and were entrepreneurs or something.
Yeah. Yeah. And for me, I had a friend who lent me $1,000 so I can go to the teacher training at White Lotus in Santa Barbara. And I went through the teacher training. I didn't teach at all when I came back. I thought I was completely inadequate as a teacher. But what was worse is I went back to the usual classes I went to at, with Steve and my teachers. And from the back, I started to correct them. It's like I had a little bit of information, and a little bit of information, is dangerous. And somehow circumstances, my life in Santa Monica didn't materialize. I didn't know what I was doing. So the opportunity to move to White Lotus, to actually move there and live there, came up, and I took it, and I lived there for almost a year, and I didn't want to leave. I didn't. It's hard for me to.
Let me ask you a question. Let me stop you for a second there. First of all, why did you leave New York? Why did you move from New York to the West Coast to be at the White Lotus?
Because, I thought I was a writer, so I thought I'm going to go out to California and
write some screenplays.
But I also missed Yogaworks. I love Jivamukti. And I've had Sharon and David, actually, when I opened Yoga Soup, they came remarkably. They came twice to teach at Yoga Soup. Love them, but I missed. There's something about Yogaworks, and those teachers. And then by the time I got back, everything had blown up. Like Steve.
Yeah, you said there was drama. Did you witness all the stuff? Like Brian talked about his beef with Monty and stuff. Like
totally.
You were there for that.
It was like Eric. Well, because I was living with. I became friendly with Saul before he became a yoga teacher, and actually introduced him to the people at White Lotus, and he lived there for a while, and then I also introduced him to Sean, and then I'm living with these two emerging superstars of the yoga world, and there's nothing in my life that's really happening. The writing isn't happening. I certainly don't think of myself as a yoga teacher. I'm lost. I mean, honestly, I'm in my mid-30s, and I'm lost. And so when I had the opportunity, God, there's so many beautiful little stories. At Sean and Saul's, the Yankees, the New York Yankees, they won the World Series. And I grew up with my grandmother, and my grandmother's dying wish was to have her ashes spread over Yankee Stadium when the Yankees win the World Series. So I had a friend who was a sports writer, and her father was a famous sportscaster, and she arranged it. So somehow I'm at Yankee Stadium with an urn full of ashes, and she had called a reporter, and it ends up on the front page of all the papers on CNN, or it's like the 15 minutes of fame. And as a result of that, I got a call from a producer that wanted to make a movie out of it. And two things happened. The story that emerged about me and my grandmother was so far from the truth of how I grew up with my grandmother. And I ended up not being able to even write my own story. And this turned off something in my mind and turned on something in my mind that I'm not even sure how I got here. Like, I'm not sure of my own story. And I moved to White Lotus, and I'd have to say, and I assisted them in their teacher trainings, which was also fascinating because
so you studied Kundalini yoga. I mean, I had Philip Dislep on recently to talk about Yogi Bhajan and like the kind of shadowy past of that tradition.
Yeah, Jay Brown, listen, I am the outlier. I see the list of interviews you have, and trust me, I'm the outlier. I have no lineage. I have no claim to fame. I am like, I don't even know how I got here. Yeah. Like, I think, my teaching, I was a cabana boy in New York at a beach club for 7 years. And I feel like that's the only job I've ever had, and I still have it. Because if you ever came to Yoga Soup, we got a place where, I make sweet potatoes, I put out prunes, I make whipped cream. I have a friend.
We'll get to that. We haven't gotten to Yoga Soup yet. So
I'm at White Lotus living there, and Ganga and Tracy, who run the place, who are amazing, they kick me out because I ain't going anywhere. I'm like, I don't know where to go. I have no money.
But why did they kick you out? I understand, because you just overstayed your welcome.
Because the room I'm renting, they wanted to remodel it and offer it to visiting teachers. It was just time. And believe me, I resented them because they were supposed to take care of me. I had projected onto them all the things that you do.
Yeah.
And they kick me out, and I end up in Santa Barbara. And I have to go to the local Santa Barbara Yoga Center and say, hey, do you need a teacher? And they had a slot, 3:30, Tuesday and Thursday.
Yes.
And so that's how I started teaching.
The middle of the day slot on Tuesday and Thursday.
Yeah, and that's how I started. And I'm 37 years old. And I have 2 people coming to my class. But that's how it started. And it really did. And then
And now wait a second. Was that yoga center in Isla Vista?
No. It's downtown Santa Barbara. It's a beautiful space. I think it used to be a church, Santa Barbara Yoga Center. And
I see, because it's a point of potential synchronicity. Like my brother went to UCSB in like 1988 or whatever. And so I just remember that town, and like Halloween was crazy. My brother stayed at a place they called the Pit, and I went one year and it was like insane. I know it's not different now, but like in 1989 or whatever, Santa Barbara was a kind of wild place. It was the first time I ever saw like vegan pizza, if I remember.
Well, I'm there, and basically my whole story, once I moved to Santa Barbara, I was just passed along with different how it is. Everyone's life, when they look back on their life, it's just full of these synchronicities that somehow encourage them along. And so I got to live in a beautiful house for 4 months in Santa Barbara. My car would barely get down the hill to get to the yoga center, but I'm also really friendly with this teacher, Steve Ross, who back in the day, he was one of the guys. He was the first guy to have a show on Oprah. He was friendly with all the stars would come to his class, Woody Harrelson and Meg Ryan. But the thing about Steve is, and he was also a session guitar player. He played with Fleetwood Mac and things like that. But he'd also go to India, unlike all the other teachers who I was meeting, but he'd really go to India. He'd go for 3 months, and he'd go to Ramana's ashram, Ramana Maharshi. He was, if you went to his apartment, the whole apartment was full of photos of Ramana. And Steve is such an amazing contradiction. He's like, but I learned so much. Like, he introduced me to Ramana Maharshi, to Nisargadatta, to, we went to see the Hugging Saint, Amachi.
Right.
He was a shameless guru hunter. He just chased the Shakti. And
what was the contradiction, though? You said just now he was a contradiction. What's the contradiction?
Well, this is Steve. He enjoyed the fruits of his profession. I mean, it was almost.
But wait a second, is the profession being a yoga teacher, or like? See, that's the thing. When you say fruits of the profession, that's one of the things that's happened in the yoga world. The reason I'm probing it is because all of our teachers, and I have them too, who kind of stepped over certain maybe professional boundaries. Things were very loose back then. Well, and over time, it changed. It became an issue. It became a problem. Like I couldn't condone it, the behavior,
Well, yes, and it's a delicate conversation.
Yeah.
For instance, I listened to Brian's interview, and that part about his brother.
Yeah.
And
it got mixed responses. It got mixed responses.
Well, I read the few comments on your thread, and it's such a volatile issue.
Yeah.
And my Brian Kest story is hysterical because I asked to interview him. We meet at a cafe in Santa Monica. I have a tape recorder.
Yeah.
And I put it on, and one of the questions I asked him is, how do you maintain your boundaries when so many people are projecting their energy towards you? I mean, you'd have to have been there to, it's not an exaggeration. It's even, I think it's harder than being a rock star, because I don't know how it was for you, but if you gave me the choice of seeing, Robert Plant, Led Zeppelin, or Krishna Das, at some point in my life, I wanted to see Krishna Das.
Yeah,
that's the only music I was listening to. And yet Krishna Das is so accessible. Here he is. He used to play at John Friend's retreats. We go up to Utah. There's Krishna Das. So the person whose musical world I'm immersed in, here he is. I'm eating dinner with him. And it's the same with yoga teachers. Like, whatever your trip is, the first adjustment I ever gave as a yoga teacher, I had my hand on a woman's back, and then, very, tender, not leaning on her. And then when I remove my hand, she starts to cry. And she turns to me and says, when you took your hand away, it reminded me of my father abandoning me. And I realized, what the hell? I am so over my head here. And it takes a while to fathom that, to really understand the internal, the psychology of what's happening, because no one's taught this in teacher training. There's no,
certainly not back then. That was not something that was being discussed.
Not back then at all. And so to finish that story, I'm interviewing Brian. I ask him that question, and he says, no, I have very strong boundaries. And as he's saying that, a woman comes running upstairs and, oblivious to me, and just confronts him and says, why'd you grab my tit at the Grateful Dead concert? And Brian says, I didn't grab your tit. I was making an adjustment. And it's on tape. And I go downstairs to let this thing play out. And of course, I don't know what really happened. It would be hard for me to believe that happened in the way it was described. But man.
So the mother was upset at him touching her daughter or her son?
No. It was the woman who had been touched.
I see.
Was saying, why'd you do that? Now, without being there, without understanding the dynamics, it's very easy, because to default into a place of that kind of judgment, rightfully so, because of how much advantage traditionally male yoga teachers, just males in general, have taken, the liberties that they've taken. It's, of course, forget the Me Too movement. Like, the Me Too movement, there's nothing, the pendulum would have to swing so much harder in the other direction to right that playing field. But that was part of the ethos back then. And, my dear friend, my dear mentor, person who I owe so much to, Steve, was part of that. Steve was, I don't say it, he just was part of that. And that was part of my teaching, though, to when I started teaching, and all of a sudden, I don't know why people are coming to my class. Like, I'm not a beautiful person. I don't have a great practice.
You can't even straighten your arms in the full wheel, or did you eventually be able to do that?
No, not really. But my point is, I got to see the projections of people who come in and the energy that creates. And if I'm getting that, me, who's just like kind of a bozo, oh my God, what's it like for people who want that, who believe in those projections, who, it further inflates.
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of Jay Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.